What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and the dying starts in Ultimate Endgame. And for those of you guys who are joining us for the first time or need a bit of a refresher here, one of the things to remember is that the Maker, an evil version of Reed Richards, trying to recreate his own universe, went to this universe here, Earth 6160, and started screwing up the time stream. Literally started going through and changing everyone's history. The goal was to turn it into the universe that he originally came from. Ultimately, he was defeated. He was locked away for 2 years. Now he's back, and there's a war across the world between the forces who were in support of the Maker and the forces that are against him. For the most part, the good guys were winning until Spider-Man died. The Maker killed him, and it was kind of bonkers. And that's where we pick up here, right? We pick up in the death of Spider-Man and the Maker taunting everybody. Now, have no illusions. Despite how hard these guys are fighting, it is hard to keep that moral compass going in the face of Peter Parker's death. Because whenever you're talking about an event like this in Marvel Comics and the superheroes start dying, that's when the moral ground begins to shift, and it's very easy for the heroes to become demoralized. But something to notice here, the Maker directly addresses Dr. Doom, and where Doom says, Spider-Man had a family, the response to the Maker, you've done it again, Doom, because one of the things to remember is that Dr. Doom is not Victor Von Doom in this new Ultimate Universe. He's Reed. The Maker screwed up the calculations when the Fantastic Four were supposed to go into space. So when they did, basically everybody but Reed died. Not immediately. Johnny Storm died right off the bat. Ben Grimm was pushed off a cliff and he died, although it was billed as a suicide. And Susan Storm ended up dying from radiation poisoning. But the long and short of it is that everyone who was close in Reed's life perished due to the experiment, and the Maker, being the one that messed it all up, took Reed and then convinced him, brainwashed him into believing he was the reason why it all happened. He'd been tormenting him the entire time. What we didn't know going into Ultimate Endgame was that the Maker left a piece of himself behind in the mind of Dr. Doom. So this Maker that you see talking to Doom, only Doom can see him. Nobody else can see him. That's an important thing. I saw some confusion about that in the comments section of the last video that we did. And so in the face of Spider-Man's death, America Chavez tells Tony Stark, bring Spider-Man back, right? Turn back time. That's the nature of the Immortus engine, right? The Immortus engine within the chest of Tony Stark does allow him to manipulate time travel, but it's not as simple as just turning the clock back. It's one of the aspects of the new Ultimate Universe. It's very much grounded in reality, or as real as reality can be when you're talking about time travel. But it's not like the main Marvel Universe, where he's like, okay, and then just go back in time and save Peter, and like, that's it. There's a lot of things you have to account for, and that's why he says, I can't. I have not totally mastered the physics in here yet. Peter Parker is gone, because keep in mind, they're fighting in a dome, and time passes differently here. It's not like it is in the real world where the rest of the war is going on. And so that's where you switch back to the Maker talking to Doom, and Doom says, we have to make it to the city center. All of this is a distraction. We are trapped in the Maker's monumental nightmares, because that's where the Maker truly resides in his real form. He quite literally is the city. And so in order to destroy the Maker, you have to destroy the city center. You have to destroy the core, which means destroying the Maker himself. And that's where this mental projection of the Maker in Doom's mind talks to him and says, my nightmares are your nightmares, Doom. Stop fighting yourself. It's embarrassing. And so America Chavez realizes, because they're on the outskirts of the city, they have to jump to the core, and they can't just simply run there. It's far too big, and there are way too many threats between them and the center of the city. So they do exactly that. They teleport to the middle of it. But because of the fact that the city is the Maker, it's quite literally fighting her efforts to teleport, trying to keep her from being able to move the team. Ultimately, she does, right? And they do arrive here. And so once they're there, that's when Tony says, focus on the Spire. It's the only way to truly hurt him. If we destroy the Spire, we destroy the Maker. It's the way in which he's controlling the entire city. But the Maker, in his true form, just kind of fires back, hurt me. I created this universe, event by event. I am the author of your lives from birth to death. I decide how it ends, not you. So again, speaking towards the idea of him going through the time stream and changing everything. And that's kind of the funny thing here, is because the mental projection of the Maker in Doom's mind tells him, and we did it with a little help from my lovely assistant, you, Reed Richards, you're the one that made all this possible. Whether Reed knew it or not, he was effectively a Trojan horse, right? With the Maker operating inside of his mind the whole time, while Reed was not aware that the Maker had a piece of himself in his mind, he was there, and he's been watching the entire time, seeing everything that's been going on, quite literally spying in secret. And so Reed just says, I won't help you, but it makes no difference, because the Maker says, you already have. Because now the Maker knows the location of the last surviving Immortus engine. That's his key to time travel, and it's his key to freeing himself, going back out into the universe and launching his conquest once again. That's the importance of time travel. That's why it matters so much. That's why you can make an argument that someone like Kang the Conqueror is one of the most powerful beings in existence, because when you have the ability to time travel, of what use are the powers of pretty much anyone around you if you can just make it so they never existed in the first place, or never even gained those powers in the first place. And so before we jump back to everything going on with Maker and Doom, we jump back to the real world and the war that's happening outside of the city. And we pick up with Vision. And he says, Vision's private thought log, the mood is concerned and focused. I am worried about the war, but I'm also worried about Captain America. And that's where they chime in. Captain America, are you listening? Your frequent absences from the Eastern Front have allowed Captain Britain to reinforce himself and regain vast swaths of territory. He is so confident he's come to observe personally. And Steve just says, yes. And so he's told, you have weakened our position here. It is an issue of morale, Steve. You are a symbol. People look up to you. The fact that you're not here gives people concern, and they almost kind of begin to lose their will to fight. If Captain America is not even willing to join this fight or be in this fight, does he believe it's hopeless? That's what we're talking about here, right? And even Steve responds and says, I know, I am starting to wonder if they even should. And Vision comments on this and says his mental state has been deteriorating since Fatherlandville. The others might not notice, but I've known him since 1941. Now, what's being referred to here? Well, there's clearly a note pertaining to Ultimates number 22. Within that story, one of the things that we learn is that Bucky Barnes became the new Red Skull, and that Steve Rogers was forced to kill him. Now, it was a really cool moment, and that's what leads into the collapse of the mental state of Steve, because as most of you guys know, Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes are best friends, and in pretty much any universe, that's the case in Marvel Comics, but particularly here, they grew up together, they were young together, that kind of thing. And so what ended up happening is that when Steve was frozen in ice, Bucky continued on. He did not become the Winter Soldier in this Ultimate Universe. Instead, what he tried to do was affect change in the world. Because keep in mind, while Steve Rogers was frozen away in a block of ice, the Maker was hopping through the time stream, changing the entire history of this universe. And where Bucky began to become demoralized was from looking at the world around him and realizing people were celebrating the actions of the Maker. But it wasn't necessarily that way. It was, but it wasn't. People can only really fight against what they know about. And as is the case with the rise of virtually any dictator, even if it is someone like the Maker who has a council that controls things behind the scenes, it's the promise of a better life, the promise of a better world, right? Give me power and I will make your wildest dreams come true. And in the insanity that was the 20th century, which in a lot of ways mirrors here in the real world, the global socioeconomic issues, the Cold War, World War II, yada, 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 that people leaned into it. People supported it. But with the story of Bucky, it's a little sadder than that. And it feeds into everything that was going on, right? When Steve Rogers learns that Bucky is Red Skull, Steve Rogers initially tells him, you turned against everything we fought for. And Bucky lashes out, right? Like, I turned against them. You're the one who betrayed them. They took apart everything we fought for, and you weren't even there. I was there. No one cared. They were happy, celebrating in the streets. And so Steve asked him, right, you just gave up. And Bucky says, gave up? No, I ran for Congress a dozen times while there still was one. I tried to make a difference, but government was already going out of fashion. The new thinking went that there was nothing between people but self-interest, checks and balances, church and state, constitutions. They were all discredited one by one. The whole democratic system was declared a failure, unequal to meet the needs of the modern man. The Maker was built building a new world, and there was no stopping it. And so the response of Steve was, well, then we die trying. That's what we do. In the face of forces like that, we do whatever we need to do to stand against it and even lay our lives on the line, which is actually a fair point. And it's a great point that Steve makes. It's kind of the hallmark and the core of his character. How much could you really believe in your message if you're not willing to put everything on the line to champion your cause, even your life? If you're not willing to do that, then your entire message, your entire goal was dead before it even started, because eventually the time will come when you will have to make that choice. And in that moment, you'll run. And that's the point that Steve is making. And that's the point that Bucky is countering here, because Bucky says, same old line, right? This thing has its own nervous system, 360-degree awareness. You would have been proud of me, Steve. I refused to be a part of it like I knew you would have. I settled for a normal life, fixing cars, but pretty soon the cars fixed themselves. I couldn't keep a job after that. I could never prove it, but I had the feeling I'd been marked, a permanent black spot on my record. Or maybe I just wasn't good enough for anything but killing. The years flew by, Steve. You can't believe it. Or maybe you can. And he says, one day I woke up and I realized I was going to die. The doctor tells him, liver failure. And so he says, I was a hero, Cap. I helped win the war. I lost everything. I lost my country. I lost you. And for what? I could take dying for something, but I couldn't take dying for nothing. And so that's when he went to visit Nick Fury. Now, Nick Fury, under the Maker's Council, was providing a false sense of hope, right? That when Bucky went to go talk to him, he simply said, I didn't want to die. And Nick Fury's response, you don't have to. Let's get this old man a dose of the infinity formula. Now, historically speaking, the infinity formula is quite literally a formula that staves off death, right? It basically keeps you young, youthful, and vibrant. It's not quite as powerful as the super soldier serum, but outside of super strength, speed, different things like that, it more or less falls within the same confines. At least that's in the main Marvel universe. In the Ultimate Universe, the two are effectively one and the same. And so that's when he says, it wasn't like I thought it was going to be, that there's always a price when it comes to something like this. Nothing ever comes for free. And so Nick Fury told him, we need you to go long-term undercover and run the Red Skulls for us. And Bucky's response, right, are you serious? Right, you really want me to work inside and infiltrate the Red Skulls? And the response of Nick, yes, but it's also an order, straight from the top. We gave you the extension to your life. You owe us now. And that's when Bucky says, I thought that there would be tanks in the street, police at your door, and there were, for some, but it wasn't like that for most. It was most likely the same as before, except we didn't vote. Hard decisions were made for us. People preferred it that way, which is true. That's exactly how the Maker's forces unfolded control within this universe. It's one of the reasons why this comic is so important. The perfect way to establish a dictatorship is to present it as a way that makes people's lives easier. So that way, they don't interpret the dictatorship as seizing control of their lives and taking away freedoms that they otherwise would have had. No, it's just, let me take a little off your plate. Let me make life a little bit easier for you. That's exactly what the Maker did. And that's how we got so much control. And that's why when the time came that he started stripping rights away from people, it wasn't about making their life harder. People didn't reject it. They didn't stand against it. They embraced it. Finally, someone's looking out for us, even if it requires us to give up a few things. Most of us weren't even participating in it in the first place, so who cares if we don't have it? And so that's when Bucky tells Steve, it doesn't seem very different until one day you realize how different your life is, how much of yourself you've lost and given away. But by then, it's too late. Not only that, you actually see how far lost Bucky was in this comic, in the sense that when he's talking to Steve Rogers, he's like, you can't kill me. And Steve asks why, and he says, for the same reason that I can't kill you, because we're brothers, and that means something. But even if it meant nothing, the reality here is that my heart is connected to a bomb that's also connected to a dead man's trigger. So if I die, if my heart stops beating, a room full of kids and pregnant women explodes, and there's no way you're going to allow that to happen. But the funny thing is that Captain America's like, we were told about that, and we basically rescued them all. So now it's just you and me. And so it comes down to a conversation between them, where Steve just said, I don't get you at all, Bucky. And Bucky's response, no, it's actually simple. So simple, you can't believe it works that way, but it does. He says, first, you say and do all these horrible things, and you hate yourself, but it's okay, because in your heart, you know that you're just pretending. It's not you, It's a performance. After a while of pretending, you stop hating yourself for it. You can only hate yourself for so long, a survival mechanism or something of that sort. A while longer, and the things you say start to make sense. After all, it is your voice. You begin to see your own point, and then it's not a performance anymore. You believe it down to your bones. That's how people get hoodwinked into these things. Cults, these hate groups, whatever the case is, people get hoodwinked into that stuff, right? Because people come to them and they make these small little points. They feel obvious, but for this individual, they feel poignant because someone finally understands them. It's the emotional toll of it. And so little by little, these points that you otherwise never would have believed and would have seemed nonsensical kind of begin to make sense, whether it's because you're saying it yourself or because you're looking at this person and saying, I mean, they were always right before, why wouldn't they be right now? And before you know it, you're suddenly caught up in this just crazy group of people. And that's where Bucky Barnes found himself. Little by little, bit by bit, he lost himself more and more until he became the Red Skull. And it was no longer about infiltrating a group, it was about becoming the leader of that group. And so he basically begs, right? And he says, I don't want to die. Please, Steve, you weren't there. You don't know. I was afraid and alone. I was so incredibly alone. And Steve just tells him, right, you are my brother, Bucky, and you always will be. I will always take care of you. And so Bucky just kind of apologizes for his actions, and Steve does the only thing he feels he can do. He breaks Bucky's neck. He kills him. He had to kill Bucky Barnes. And so jumping back here to Ultimate Endgame, that's why he's so unhinged. He had to destroy the one person in the world who was his closest friend, someone he grew up with, and who ultimately ended up falling down this path. So for Steve Rogers, it's not a matter of, oh my God, I lost Bucky. It's, I failed Bucky. Bucky became the person he was because I wasn't there to steer him away from that path. But there is a measure of personal responsibility here. At what point is it no longer about no one was there to guide you, and it's about you made that choice on your own? Where does that personal accountability come into play? Because you can only blame everybody else for so long before you just start coming across as lazy and incompetent. And so that's where Steve has to kind of figure things out. But on the personal level, it's hard. On the personal level, it's hard to do that. And his mental state has been slipping ever since. And so again, back in this fight where he's dealing with everything on the Eastern Front, Vision says, I am trying an outdated concept, common in our day, known as tough love, to snap Steve out of it and to get him back to his normal state. And Steve just says, I let my emotions cloud my judgment. You deserve better than that. You all deserve better than that. But in hearing this, the Vision's response is, he's most likely just telling me what I want to hear. The reality is, on the inside, he's in shambles. Right? He is a shell of his former self. He's not the confident Captain America that he used to be. He was destroyed because he had to kill his own best friend. And so the information continues on, right? King T'Challa wants to speak about Latveria, and the response of Steve, better not keep him waiting then. Now, this is one of the interesting concepts of Ultimate's Endgame, because for a good chunk of this story, T'Challa was just kind of over in Wakanda, operating as a king, while Storm and Eric Killmonger, with Killmonger basically being a good guy, and the hand of T'Challa himself, was dealing with a lot of the threats on the ground level. T'Challa has since joined the actual conflict, but the fact is, the Vision tells Steve Black Panther is on the network. And so Steve just responds, right, thank you T'Challa for joining in the whole conflict. And T'Challa just says, I understand your generation was relatively straightforward, so you won't be offended if I dispense with formalities. And the response of Steve, yeah, that would be great actually, right? I don't care about the pomp and circumstance. Talk to me directly. And so where Steve is in Boston, T'Challa's in Latveria, and he says, despite the best efforts of Storm, myself, and the Wakandan army, the situation of Latveria has only grown worse, exponentially worse, because the forces of the Maker are functioning outside of the city. And he says, we have so far prevented the Maker hive mind from breaching the dome, but the infection continues to spread. We've isolated the infecting agent, but it resists all analysis, because that's the goal of the Maker's forces outside of the city. The Maker and the Ultimates, Tony Stark, America Chavez, Dr. Doom, all of them, they're inside the dome, but the Maker's forces outside of it are trying to get to the dome, crack it open, so the Maker can be freed, and then basically go back out into the world and start wreaking havoc again. Hence the war on two fronts. Because T'Challa says, on my orders, the Wakandan army has quarantined the capital and erected a self-replicating wall around the entire city. city. As far as we know, no Maker spawn has escaped the exclusion zone. I have looked into their eyes, and it was him. It was the Maker. He's infected them somehow with himself, and the infection is spreading. And Steve Rogers tells T'Challa, right, we've sent you every spare man, woman, and superhuman that we have. Nearly the entire Fantastic Force is now deployed to Latveria. We could lose the West Coast because of it, because it was a big gamble, right? The most important part of this war is making sure the dome does not come down and the Maker does not escape. And so that's why they might lose the West Coast, because the reality here is that with everything happening on the West, now they're fighting with a skeleton crew. Because remember, yes, you have the Maker, and yes, the Maker ruled Earth for a period of time, but he also had his own council, and his council have their own forces, and those are the forces that everyone else is fighting against. And so T'Challa just says, I understand, Captain, this is an existential threat to Wakanda and the world. And so he says, I'm calling to inform you and the Ultimates that I have targeted Latveria with sufficient vibranium-enhanced nuclear warheads to sterilize the country. They're gonna nuke the joint. Black Panther's gonna nuke the place, which is crazy, but he doesn't really feel like he has any other choice. Because the response, are you crazy? You're gonna nuke the entire area. But at the end of the day, T'Challa says, I am king. It is not only my right, but my duty to protect my people. And should I deem it necessary, I will. And this is one of the core aspects of T'Challa, no matter what universe you are in. And it's one of the things that's so important about him. When it comes to T'Challa in Marvel Comics, he doesn't care, like, he will burn down the world if it means keeping Wakanda safe. He'll sacrifice the entire world. He will nuke it into oblivion if it means protecting his people. Yes, he's a superhero, and yes, he works alongside the Avengers, despite the fact that he originally joined the team to spy on it, but none of that matters in comparison to his role as a king and a protector of his kingdom. It's a beautiful moment, and I love that this is being maintained within the Ultimate Universe. And so at that point, we switch back to the Maker and the Ultimates, and the mental projection of the Maker in Doom's mind tells him, you should be me by now, Doom. The microplastic machines that entered through your wounds should have made you into my Echo. You should have been transformed by now as soon as you entered the city. But Doom just tells him, America, if you have not yet activated the distress beacon the Guardians of the Galaxy gave you, now would be the time. Now, we didn't see the Guardians for very long in the new Ultimate Universe. They showed up momentarily. They gave a warning to the Ultimates. You guys don't understand what's coming later on down the line. The threat is going to be severe, and you guys may very well lose everything. But America Chavez elected to stay behind and join the Ultimates. And so that's when the Guardians gave her a beacon and said, okay, like, if you really want to stay here and you really want to take the risk of dying in the conflict with the Maker, that's fine, right? Just take this beacon, activate it when the time comes that you need our help, and we will be there to help you. And the Guardians are immensely powerful. They're not all powerful, but they are immensely powerful nonetheless. And so that's when you switch over to Tony, who's attacking the Maker, and he says, whatever you're made of will stay alive for millions of years, but not billions. And so this is him effectively saying they can wear down the Maker given enough time. But it's also America chiming in and saying, I activated that beacon just after we got trapped here. This signal cannot get through the dome. So seemingly, there's no way for us to get a hold of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Not only that, the mental projection of the Maker, when he's talking to Doom, he says, you're fighting me. That's why you haven't transformed yet. You should not be able to do that. Right? I don't know how it is that you're able to do it. I thought I cut that piece out of your brain a long time ago when I turned you into Dr. Doom, but I must have missed a little bit. And he says, but then again, you are a Reed Richards. Even if you're the Reed of this reality, we're famously full of surprises. And so he says, you're even hiding something from me, a secret. And that's fine. I know that you're doing that. And I have allowed you your secret because while you have been so focused on keeping it, I have had full access to the rest of your mind. Quite literally, you're so focused on what's happening over here, you're not paying attention to what's happening over there. And in looking at everything that's happening over there, Doom, I know where the Immortus engine is. And so the Maker has found the one thing he's been hunting for. And he says, what was taken from me, it goes far beyond the physical. Because what we end up learning is that when the Maker was first locked away here alongside Tony Stark's father, who at this point is dead within the Ultimate Universe, that also included the location of the Immortus engine and how to work the Immortus engine. That's one of the best ways to overcome the Maker, is to basically screw with his brain. Knowledge is the most powerful thing the Maker has, given how intelligent he is. When you start removing sections of his brain, there's certain things he's just not going to be able to remember. And that's what happened here. But that's why it was so important that he accessed the other parts of Dr. Doom's brain, because he says, with Howard's time machine, that pirate excised a piece of my life, a part of my mind. Certain capacities were lost. There are thoughts that I can never have. But that's why genes come in complementary pairs, Doom. What I'm missing, you're not missing. What was taken from me, I will have again. And so that is when the Immortus engine is brought directly to the Maker. And all the information he lost in his initial conflict with Tony Stark's father, he's learned by pilfering through the mind of Dr. Doom. And so that's why he says, so thanks for the help with chronomechanics, Doom. Without the use of your mind, it would have taken months to find it. And that's where things go sideways, because this is the one thing the Maker needed to be able to come back, to bring himself back. It's the one thing he had to have above all others. And now that he has it, it's effectively game over, because Tony Stark, in looking at this, says he's going to break the dome, right? He's about to break free. And that's when you switch over to Captain America and Duggery, because keep in mind, Duggery controls a huge section of the world, but he was part of the Maker's Council, right? The Illuminati, as you and I would call it. Him arriving here personally is to actually attack Steve Rogers, because facing off against Steve Rogers is a symbolic gesture, right? It's quite literally the way things are now versus the way things used to be, right? Freedom versus dictatorship, right? Absolute rule. And so when he arrives here, he says, I love to visit the colonies. You see such sights. And so Steve Rogers is told, get your head in the game, right? Like, this is serious, right? This guy showing up here is no small thing. And so Duggery just says, natives in their colorful costumes, savagery you just don't find in proper civilization. And that's the crazy thing behind it, because Vision's trying to help out Steve, right? That Duggery may come across as incompetent, he may come across as a buffoon, and in fact, in some ways he is, but the reality is he's incredibly powerful and incredibly capable. And so it's basically Vision telling Steve Rogers, be on your guard, because the moment you let yourself slip, it's gonna be the endgame. There's no way you're gonna come out against this guy in one piece. And so that's where Duggery continues on, right? Only in the colonies can you throw away all the old morals and really let loose. And the fight between the two of them is extreme. When you're talking about someone with a level of strength and durability and speed that Captain Britain has, it's almost impossible for Steve Rogers to beat him, and he can't, right? Duggery says, you know, you actually hurt us, Captain. I commend you on that. No one else has come close, but you have gotten careless and forgotten your betters. And so at that point, he just overcomes Steve with the greatest of ease. He says, Irish, aren't you? That's a defect of the Irish, carelessness. And so Steve just says, right, like, I'm American, go to hell. But the response of Duggery, you are boring. What you call patriotism, we call nationalism. You made a new name for the sake of appearance, but the old one was truer. I think nationalism was mankind's great stupidity. I have much more in common with the Russian royal family or a Persian prince than I do with a French maid or a British shopkeeper. It's a question of breeding, of blood. And at that moment, he cuts off the hand of Steve Rogers, right? He cuts off Steve's hand, so Steve doesn't have his shield. He's effectively defenseless at this point. And so he says, that's just a flesh wound, right? Clearly a reference to Monty Python, but he says, you hate nations so much, you're wrapped in the Union Jack. And that's where you find out the whole basis behind it, is that Duggery says, indeed, symbols, Captain, this costume, this army, these are symbols of my station, of total domination of my enemies. You wear the American flag to inspire hope. I wear the Union Jack to remind people it's hopeless to fight against me. And he says, I have put Britain's myths in chains, but America's I will simply kill. And in that moment, cuts off the head of Steve Rogers. He kills him on the spot, right? And he just looks down at his corpse and says, how fun. I love an unfair fight. And so in that moment, you switch back to the Maker. And the funny thing is that when Wakanda goes to fire off its nukes, once they get to the spot where they are about to detonate, they vanish. They disappear because the Guardians of the Galaxy have arrived on the scene. And at that point, everybody's told, do not panic, right? The primitive nuclear devices have been converted to music. No one will be harmed. The Guardians of the Galaxy will save all we can, which is just an incredible level of power. But we also get to see the Guardians united in their full totality and all their forces brought to bear, which also includes Cosmo, which is dope to see, right? A telepathic dog joining the entirety of the Guardians. But at that point, they start whisking people away. Right, we have trapped the Maker's marionettes in a temporary prison pocket universe. Quite literally, they're trapped in a cosmic cube, and this is a pretty cool reference to see it brought here. Cosmic cubes in Marvel Comics typically house the power of the Beyonders. It's just cool to see that in the Ultimate Universe, it's a whole different device. Instead of it being a containment unit for power, it's basically a prison cell. Not only that, while they are taking out all the forces of the Maker and sterilizing the area from the Maker's forces, at the end of the day, they realize they've arrived here about a minute or so before America Chavez sent out the beacon. So they were essentially already on their way here, right? But it makes no difference. The dome is coming down now that the Maker has the Immortus engine. And as soon as he emerges, it's this grand decree. I will unmake this entire universe and no one can stop me. Now I have the ability to time travel. I can disappear from this place immediately and that'll be the end of it. And so that's where Tony Stark does the only thing he can do, right? All available Ultimates get to the city. The Maker is free. If we don't stop him here, we lose the entirety of this universe. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.